Human Rights Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I make this statement in my capacity as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner on behalf of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Australia's national human rights institution. I commend the work of EMRIP on the Declaration. I also commend the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Asia Pacific Forum, with whom we are currently working to develop a training toolkit for NHRIs on the declarations. NHRIs are required to protect and promote all human rights of all persons. However, because Indigenous peoples represent some of the most marginalised and vulnerable people in the world, there are strong arguments for NHRIs to pay particular attention to Indigenous peoples' human rights. NHRIs are uniquely placed to operate as a conduit between the international human rights standards and the on-the-ground reality experienced by Indigenous peoples. Consequently, NHRIs have a key strategic role to play in states giving full effect to the standards contained in the Declaration. In December 2010, my office launched an initial suite of community education materials on the Declaration. These materials were funded by the Christensen Fund and Oxfam Australia and have been widely distributed to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and communities, with reprinting costs being met by the Australian Government. When I return to Australia, I will launch the next instalment of the materials, a short documentary on the Declaration and its application in the Australian context, and will work to produce an interactive website. Mr. Chair, the Australian Human Rights Commission will make these materials available to other states and Indigenous peoples to assist them give full effect to the Declaration. While these materials are raising awareness and increasing understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, little work has been done within the government in this regard. Firstly, let me acknowledge that the work the Australian Government is currently doing to develop a national human rights framework in Australia, and the significant work that is required to be done to educate the Australian public service about human rights. I also acknowledge that the Australian Government has committed support for the establishment of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples and is currently undertaking a process which has bipartisan political support to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Australian Constitution. These are welcome initiatives. However, the Australian Government should be applying a holistic and coordinated approach to giving full effect to the Declaration. In 2009, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs confirmed that Australia's existing international obligations are mirrored in the Declaration. More recent statements made by the Government on one hand assert that their laws, policies and programs are consistent with the Declaration, while on the other hand they assert that the Declaration is not legally binding, and as such the Government has no legal obligation to its implementation. It is my concern that governments are using this status of the Declaration to avoid their responsibility to implement human rights as they apply to Indigenous peoples. I'm also concerned that the Declaration contains a number of rights and principles that governments are finding difficult to understand and implement, particularly the right to self-determination and the principle of free, prior and informed consent. There is need for a detailed practical guidance at the international level to inform states on the content of these crucial rights and principles. This lack of understanding about what implementation of the Declaration looks like is impeding action. In addition to the increased international guidance on the Declaration, holistic and targeted action plans at the domestic level are required to give full effect to the Declaration. This proposed approach is particularly relevant for the Australian Government as it designs and develops its National Human Rights Framework, which includes the development of a National Action Plan on Human Rights. Unfortunately, as it currently stands, the National Human Rights Framework does not explicitly acknowledge the Declaration, how the Declaration will guide the framework, or how an action plan will be implemented as it relates to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. My recommendations, Mr. Chair, are the EMRIP and the Human Rights Council urge all councils to commit to giving full effect to the Declaration by using it to guide them in the protection, promotion and realisation of all human rights as they apply to Indigenous peoples. That EMRIP work closely with the Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to develop a detailed practical guidance to states in the development of strategies and action plans that give full effect to the the Declaration at the national, regional and local levels. That EMRIP and the Human Rights Council urge all states to enter formal dialogues with Indigenous peoples and their representatives to develop agreed understandings on the core principles in the Declaration, in particular the principles of free, prior and informed consent, self-determination, and then negotiate appropriate mechanisms for their realisation. That EMRIP and the Human Rights Council urge all states to develop holistic and targeted action plans to give full effect to the Declaration. For NHRIs to play a proactive role and creative role in the implementation of the Declaration and work towards the ratification of ILO 169 for those countries that have not done so. For concerned national governments to enact, review and amend if necessary existing domestic laws to support the implementation of the Declaration. And for NHRIs as well as the national government to adopt measures or plans and strategies to implement the Declaration and to review for those who have already plans in partnership with the Indigenous peoples. Thank you, Mr. Chair.